The year was 1000 AD. The place was Thingvellir, Iceland. The Althing, the great assembly of the island, was in chaos. For years, a new religion had been spreading. It came from Norway, from the powerful King Olaf Tryggvason. It was Christianity. Some Icelandic chieftains had converted. Others held fast to the old gods, to Odin and Thor. Now, the two sides stood on the verge of open war, right there at the most sacred gathering of the year. The Christian faction had declared they would no longer follow the same laws as the pagans. The pagans had declared the same. Iceland, a young republic founded on the principle of a single law for all, was about to tear itself apart. A man named Haller, a Sea-Doo, a respected Christian chieftain, made a proposal. He walked over to the pagan side. He spoke to Thorgeir Ljósvetningagodi. Thorgeir was the lawspeaker. For 3 years, it was his duty to recite the law from the Logberg, the Law Rock. He was known for his wisdom and moderation. Haller offered him a deal. He asked Thorgeir to be the one to decide the law for all of Iceland. Which god would they worship? Which law would they follow? The Christians agreed to abide by his decision. After much debate, the pagans, trusting Thorgeir's character more than anyone else's, also agreed. The fate of an entire nation was placed in the hands of one man. Thorgeir did not make a speech. He did not call for witnesses. He went back to his turf-walled booth. He laid down and pulled a fur cloak over his head, covering himself completely. He stayed that way for a full day and the following night. No one disturbed him. He was in communication with the law itself, or perhaps with his own deepest thoughts. The next day he rose. He walked to the Law Rock. A huge crowd gathered, silent and tense. He began to speak. He told them there was only one way for them to live in peace. That was to have one law and one faith. He laid out the problems of a divided people. He then gave his ruling. All of Iceland should be Christian. All people should be baptized, but he added compromises. It would still be legal to expose unwanted infants, as was the old custom. It would still be legal to eat horseflesh, a practice forbidden by the new church but important to the old ways. And most importantly, people could continue to sacrifice to the old gods as long as they did it in private. If no one saw, there was no crime. It was a stunningly pragmatic solution. It was a political masterpiece wrapped in a legal ruling. Both sides accepted it. There was no civil war. Iceland converted to Christianity not by the sword, but by the word of its lawspeaker. This was the true power of the office. It was not just about reciting old rules. It was about shaping the future, holding a society together with nothing but wisdom and trust. Number 17, the lawspeaker's power was not absolute. Ulfljótur was the man credited with bringing law to Iceland. Around 927 AD, he was sent to Norway by the early Icelandic chieftains. His mission was to study the laws of the Gulathing, a regional assembly in western Norway. He spent 3 years there. He learned the structure of the laws, the procedures for disputes, and the role of the lawspeaker. When he returned, he adapted what he had learned for Iceland's unique society, a land with no king. The code he helped create became the foundation of the Icelandic Commonwealth. He is sometimes called Iceland's first lawspeaker, a figure of immense respect. The law was named Ulfljótur's Law in his honor. But even with this foundational role, the power of the lawspeaker was always conditional. It rested on the consent of the powerful chieftains, the Godar. A story from the Sturlunga saga, which covers the later, more violent period of the Commonwealth, illustrates this point clearly. In the early 13th century, the office of lawspeaker was held by Snorri Sturluson, one of the most famous and ambitious men in Icelandic history. Snorri was a brilliant poet, historian, and politician. He was also deeply enmeshed in the power struggles that were beginning to rip the country apart. In 1224, a man named Tumi Sævatsson was involved in a major feud with another powerful family. The case was brought to the Althing. Snorri Sturluson, as lawspeaker, was responsible for guiding the proceedings. He understood the letter of the law better than anyone. He knew the correct procedures, the required number of witnesses, and the precise wording of the oaths. He outlined the legal path forward for both parties. The law, as he stated it, was clear. The case should proceed to a panel of judges who would hear the evidence and deliver a verdict. This was the system, this was the law he was tasked to uphold. But the chieftains involved had no interest in a peaceful legal resolution. Their honor was at stake, their power was on the line, they had brought their armed followers to the Althing. The assembly grounds at Thingvellir looked more like a military camp than a court of law. One of the chieftains, Bodvar Thordarson, simply ignored Snorri's legal guidance. Instead of proceeding to the court, he and his men drew their weapons. A rival chieftain did the same. The legal proceedings dissolved. The Althing, the center of Icelandic law and order, became a battlefield. Men were killed in the fighting that followed. Snorri Sturluson, the law speaker, was powerless to stop it. He could speak the law, he could recite the procedures, he could advise the chieftains, but he had no army. He commanded no warriors, he was not a king or a sheriff. The role of the law speaker was to be an impartial voice of the law. The enforcement of that law, however, was up to the individuals and families involved in the dispute. If a powerful man chose to reject a legal ruling and resort to violence, the law speaker could do nothing but watch. The law was a powerful idea, a shared agreement, but it was only as strong as the willingness of the powerful to abide by it. Snorri's experience in 1224 was a harsh lesson. The law speaker was the brain of the legal system, but the chieftains were its muscle. When the muscle decided to act on its own, the brain's commands were just words carried away on the wind. This was the fundamental weakness at the heart of the Viking Age legal system, a weakness that would eventually lead to its collapse. The law speaker's authority was immense, but it was moral and intellectual, not physical. Number 16, they were paid in goods, not gold. The role of the law speaker was a public service, but it was also a demanding, full-time commitment, especially during the weeks of the Althing. A man could not be expected to perform such a vital function for free. His time, his knowledge, and his voice had value. In a society that largely operated on a barter system, this value was translated into tangible goods. The law speaker did not receive a salary in coins. He received a practical, useful payment that reflected the economy of the time. The Gragas, the law code of the Icelandic Commonwealth, specifies the law speaker's compensation with great precision. Each year, the law speaker was entitled to 240 ells of wadmal. An ell was a standard unit of measurement, roughly the length of a forearm from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, about half a meter. Wadmal was a coarse, durable woolen cloth, the single most important textile in the Viking Age economy. It was used for everything from clothing and blankets to ship sails. It was so standardized and universally accepted that it functioned as a form of currency. You could trade wadmal for silver, for livestock, for food, or for weapons. In addition to the wadmal, the law speaker also received 1/8 of all fines paid at the Althing for procedural errors or minor infractions. This created a direct incentive for the law speaker to ensure the assembly ran smoothly and that everyone followed the correct legal protocols. If a man made a mistake in his summons or fumbled the wording of an oath, a small fine might be imposed. A fraction of that fine went directly to the law speaker. Let's consider a law speaker like Rafn Ketilsson. He served as law speaker of the Althing from 1119 to 1124. Rafn was a prominent chieftain from the west of Iceland. He was a wealthy man in his own right with a large farm and many dependents, but the payment he received as law speaker was not trivial. This payment would have come from the public purse, funded by taxes paid by the farmers who attended the thing. The collection and payment of this wadmal was a logistical process. At the Althing, each chieftain was responsible for collecting the tax from the farmers in his district. This would be brought to Thingvellir. The law speaker's share would be measured out and formally given to him. This public act reinforced his status and the community's investment in his role. He wasn't just a wise man giving free advice, he was a paid public official, compensated by the people he served. The payment in goods rather than coin tells us a lot about the Viking Age world. It was a practical, resource-based economy. Wealth was measured in land, livestock, and useful commodities. A roll of good cloth was far more useful to Rafn Ketilsson than a pouch of foreign silver coins, which would have to be weighed and tested for purity before they could be used. The wadmal had a known stable value. This form of payment grounded the highest legal office in the land in the everyday reality of the people. The law speaker, who spoke the law for farmers and herders, was paid in the very product of their labor. Number 15, sickness was a valid reason to quit. The job of law speaker was physically demanding. During the Althing, the law speaker had to stand on the law rock, the logberg, and speak for hours on end, day after day. His voice had to carry across a large, open space, reaching hundreds of people without the aid of modern amplification. And he had to endure the notoriously unpredictable Icelandic weather, which could shift from sunny and mild to cold, rainy, and windy in a matter of minutes. Beyond the recitation, he was constantly in consultation, mediating disputes, and providing legal advice from dawn until late at night. The mental strain was immense, but the physical toll was just as great. The Icelandic law codes recognized this reality. The office was not a life sentence. A law speaker served a 3-year term and he could be reelected. But what if his health failed during his term? The law provided a clear and honorable way out. Sickness was a legitimate reason for a law speaker to resign his post. This was not seen as a failure or a weakness, but as a practical necessity. A law speaker who was too ill to speak clearly or to think sharply could not perform his duties. He would be a liability to the entire legal system. We have a specific account of this happening. Grimur Sverdingsson was elected law speaker of the Althing in 1002, just 2 years after the conversion to Christianity. He was a respected chieftain from the south of Iceland. He took over the role from Thorgeir Leosvetningagodi, the man who had overseen the conversion. Grimur served his first year without incident. He stood on the law rock and recited the laws as required. However, in the summer of 1003, as the Althing was set to convene, Grimur's voice failed him. The sagas describe him as having a severe throat ailment. He was hoarse and weak. He knew he could not fulfill the most fundamental part of his job, speaking the law to the assembled people. To attempt to do so would have been a disservice to the law itself, so Grimur Sverdingsson did what the law allowed. He formally resigned his position due to his illness. His resignation triggered a specific procedure. The chieftains had to find a replacement. They needed someone who was not only knowledgeable, but also available and willing to take on the role immediately. The man they turned to was one of the wisest men in Iceland, Njal Thorgeirsson, the famous sage from Bergthorshvoll, the central figure of Njal's saga. The chieftains approached Njal and asked him to take over as law speaker. Njal, however, declined. It's not clear why. Perhaps he felt he was too old, or perhaps he did not want the political exposure of the office. With Njal's refusal, the search continued. The chieftains eventually settled on a man named Skapti Thoradsson. Skapti accepted the role and served as law speaker for the next 27 years, becoming one of the longest-serving and most influential law speakers in Icelandic history. The story of Grimur Sverdigsson's resignation is important. It shows that the office of law speaker was not about a single, indispensable man. It was about a function. The system was designed with contingencies. The law was more important than the individual who spoke it. The provision for resignation due to sickness was a humane and practical rule that ensured the continuity and integrity of the legal process. It acknowledged human frailty and put the health of the community's legal system above the ego or ambition of any one person. Number 14, they had to recite 1/3 of the law code each year. The law in early Viking society was not written down. There were no books, no scrolls, no courthouses with dusty legal archives. The law existed in the minds of the people, and most completely in the mind of one person, the law speaker. This placed an extraordinary burden on his memory. He was a living library, the sole repository of the entire legal framework that governed his society. To ensure this knowledge was never lost and was accessible to everyone, the law speaker had a specific monumental task to perform at every major assembly. In Iceland, the law speaker was required to recite the entire law code from memory at the Althing over the course of his 3-year term. This meant that each year he had to stand before the assembled crowd and recite 1/3 of the law. The section dealing with public law, the procedures of the thing itself, was recited every single year. This was the most critical part of the code, the operating manual for their entire system of governance. The other sections, covering everything from inheritance and land boundaries to marriage and compensation for injury, would be recited in rotation over the 3-year cycle. Think of Snorri Sturluson standing on the Logberg around the year 1215. The wind would be blowing across the open plain of Thingvellir. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people would be gathered below him. They were there not just to settle their own disputes, but to listen. This recitation was a public performance, a ritual that reaffirmed their shared commitment to the law. Snorri's voice would have to be strong and clear. His memory had to be flawless. How could anyone possibly memorize so much information? The laws were not written in dense prose. They were often structured in poetic, alliterative verse. This made them much easier to remember. Rhythm, rhyme, and alliteration are powerful mnemonic devices. The laws were learned as songs or long poems. It's a phrase like, "A man must be summoned with a specific summons," might be rendered in a more memorable, formulaic way with repeated sounds and a clear cadence. The law speaker would not be just recalling facts, he would be performing a well-rehearsed piece of oral literature. This annual recitation served several purposes. First, it was a practical way to disseminate the law. Everyone present at the thing heard it directly from the most authoritative source. Young people learned the law by listening to the law speaker year after year. Second, it was a check on the law speaker's power, since many of the older chieftains and wise men in the crowd would also know large portions of the law. They could listen for any errors or omissions. The law speaker couldn't just invent a new law to suit his own purposes. The recitation was a public audit of his knowledge. Finally, it was a powerful act of social cohesion. The sound of the law, spoken aloud in the open air, bound the scattered farmers and chieftains of Iceland together. It reminded them that they were not just isolated households, but a community, a commonwealth, governed by a shared set of rules. The voice of the law speaker was the voice of their society. The feat of memory required was immense, but it was the central pillar supporting their entire kingless state. It was a system built on the power of the spoken word and the disciplined mind of a single, dedicated individual. Number 13, their term of office was fixed. In a society of powerful, often competing chieftains, stability was crucial. The office of the law speaker could not be a position held for life, as that would concentrate too much power in one person for too long. Nor could it be a role that changed hands every year, as that would create instability and a lack of continuity. The Icelanders, in designing their commonwealth, found a middle ground. They established a fixed term of office for their law speaker. According to the Gragas, the law speaker of the Althing was elected for a term of 3 summers. This 3-year cycle was deeply significant. It was tied directly to his duty to recite the entire law code. In his first year, he would recite 1/3 in his second year, the next third, and in his third and final year, the last third. By the end of his term, the entire community had heard the complete body of the law. A new law speaker would then begin the cycle again. This fixed term created a predictable and orderly transfer of power. Everyone knew when a law speaker's term would end. This prevented the kind of uncertainty that can lead to conflict. It also meant that the law speaker was ultimately accountable to the chieftains who elected him. If they were displeased with his performance, his interpretations of the law, or his political leanings, they knew they would have the opportunity to choose someone else in 3 years' time. It was a system of checks and balances, Viking style. Consider the case of Thorkel Mani Thorsteinsson. He was a respected law speaker who served from 970 to 984. This means he was elected to 5 consecutive 3-year terms. His long tenure suggests he was widely respected and seen as fair and competent. The chieftains repeatedly chose to entrust him with the office. His story shows that a good law speaker could be re-elected, providing continuity. Conversely, the system also allowed for change. When a law speaker died in office or resigned, a new one was chosen to complete the term or start a new one. This happened when Grimur Sverdingsson resigned due to illness in 1003. Skapti Thoroddsen was elected to replace him. Skapti then went on to be re-elected for many terms, serving until 1030. His long service highlights a period of relative stability where the chieftains were satisfied with his leadership. The 3-year term also had a personal dimension for the lawspeaker. It was a significant commitment of time and energy, but it was not a lifelong burden. A man could serve his term and then return to managing his farm and his own affairs. It allowed for a rotation of talent and perspective within the office. It ensured that the lawspeaker did not become too detached from the concerns of the ordinary people he served. The concept of a fixed term for a high-ranking official was quite advanced for its time. In an age dominated by hereditary kings and chieftains who held power for life, the Icelandic system was remarkably democratic in spirit. It subjected the highest legal authority in the land to a regular, periodic review by his peers. This simple rule, a 3-summer term, was a key ingredient in the success and longevity of the Icelandic Commonwealth. It balanced the need for expertise and authority with the equally important need for accountability and renewal. Number 12. A mistake in recitation could be corrected by committee. The lawspeaker was human, he could get tired, he could be distracted. His memory, however prodigious, was not infallible. What happened if he made a mistake while reciting the law at the Althing? What if he forgot a clause or misstated a legal formula? In a system that depended entirely on the accuracy of his spoken word, such an error could have serious consequences. A wrongly stated law could lead to an unjust outcome in a dispute. The Icelanders had a system to deal with this possibility. The lawspeaker did not operate in a vacuum. The law specified that he should consult with 5 or more wise men on any points of law he was unsure about. At the Althing, this group often included former lawspeakers or chieftains renowned for their legal knowledge. When the lawspeaker was on the law rock, these men would be listening intently. They were the peer reviewers of the oral legal system. If the lawspeaker recited a part of the law and there was a disagreement, if someone in the crowd, particularly one of the wise men, believed he had said something wrong, a specific procedure was followed. The recitation would be paused. The lawspeaker would confer with his panel of experts. They would discuss the disputed point. The goal was to reach a consensus on the correct wording of the law. The Islandingabok, the Book of the Icelanders, written by Ari the Wise in the early 12th century, mentions this consultative process. Ari himself was a fount of legal and historical knowledge, the kind of person who would have been part of such a committee. The process was not about shaming the lawspeaker for his mistake. It was a collaborative effort to ensure the integrity of the law. The law belonged to the community, not just to the lawspeaker. His role was to be its primary guardian, but every wise man had a stake in its preservation. Imagine a scene from around 1050. The lawspeaker Gellir Bolverksson is reciting the laws of inheritance. He outlines the complex rules for how property should be divided. A chieftain from a distant fjord, known for his sharp memory, notices a small but important omission in the rules regarding inheritance by a second cousin. He doesn't shout out or cause a scene. After the recitation, he would quietly approach one of the designated wise men. The concern would be relayed to Gellir. Gellir, as lawspeaker, would not be offended. He would call together his advisors. The old chieftain would be invited to state his case. They would debate the point, with each person drawing on their own memory of what they had heard recited at past things. They might recall old cases where this specific point of law was applied. After deliberation, they would reach an agreement. If the lawspeaker had indeed been wrong, he would be expected to issue a correction from the law rock the next day, so that everyone heard the true version of the law. This system had a profound effect. It made the law resilient. It was not dependent on the flawless memory of a single individual. It was a shared collective memory held and maintained by the wisest members of the community. This consultative process was a safeguard against both accidental error and intentional manipulation. A lawspeaker could not easily change the law to benefit himself or his friends, because the committee of wise men would be there to call him out. It was a simple, elegant solution that made the oral legal tradition of Iceland remarkably robust and reliable. Number 11, they were not judges, but legal guides. A common misconception about the Viking lawspeaker is that he was a judge. People imagine him sitting in a high seat, listening to two sides of a dispute, and then banging a gavel to deliver a final verdict. This picture is completely wrong. The law speaker's role was far more subtle and, in some ways, more complex. He was not the judge, he was the ultimate legal consultant. He was the guide who showed others how to navigate the intricate pathways of the law. In the Viking legal system, especially in Iceland, the function of judging was performed by a panel of ordinary free men, often the neighbors of the accused. At the Althing, there were courts, but the judges in these courts were chieftains or men appointed by them. Their role was to listen to the evidence presented and to swear oaths about whether the plaintiff had presented his case correctly. They decided the facts of the case, so where did the law speaker fit in? His role was to advise on procedure. The law was a complex machine with very specific rules. If you wanted to sue your neighbor, you couldn't just show up at the thing and complain. You had to follow a precise set of steps. You had to summon him in a particular way, with a certain number of witnesses. You had to state your charge using an exact legal formula. You had to present your evidence in the correct order. If you made a single mistake in this process, your entire case could be thrown out. This is where the law speaker was essential. Before a case began, or even during it, either party could go to the law speaker and ask for guidance. A chieftain might approach him and say, "My kinsman was injured. What is the correct way to bring a case for compensation? How many men do I need for my panel of judges? What is the precise wording of the oath my witnesses must swear?" The law speaker, for instance, a man like Thorgeir Ljósvetningagodi, would then explain the law. He would not offer an opinion on whether the kinsman deserved compensation. He would not comment on the guilt or innocence of the accused. He would simply state the procedure. He would say, "You must summon him before 9 of his neighbors. You must state the charge as follows. Your witnesses must swear this oath. If you do these things, your case is legally valid." Njal's saga is filled with examples of this. The saga is a long and complex story of legal battles interspersed with violent feuds. Characters constantly consult legal experts on the correct way to proceed. The law speaker at the Althing is the final arbiter of these procedural questions. When two parties disagree on a point of law, not on the facts, but on the rules of the game, they go to the law speaker. He makes a pronouncement from the law rock, not about who is right or wrong in the dispute, but about what the law says they must do next. This separation of roles was a sophisticated legal concept. The law speaker's job was to ensure the legal process itself was fair and correct. The judge's job was to determine the facts. The plaintiff's and defendant's job was to execute the procedure flawlessly. By remaining neutral on the outcome of specific cases, the law speaker maintained his authority and impartiality. He was the guardian of the legal process, not a decider of individual fates. This made his office respected by all sides, as everyone, plaintiff or defendant, needed his guidance to make their case. Number 10. The law speaker's home often served as a legal archive. Before the widespread use of writing, knowledge was stored in people. A blacksmith's knowledge of metal was in his hands and his head. A skald's collection of poems existed in his memory. For the law, the primary archive was the law speaker himself. But this knowledge wasn't just abstract, it was tied to a place the law speaker's farm. His home became an unofficial legal center, a place where the law was not only remembered, but also taught and discussed. Throughout the year, when the Althing was not in session, people with legal problems would travel to the law speaker's home. A farmer involved in a boundary dispute with his neighbor wouldn't wait until the next summer to seek advice. Or he might make a journey of several days to consult the law speaker. He would be offered hospitality, a meal, and a place to sleep, as was the custom. In the evening, sitting by the long fire in the main hall, he would explain his problem. The law speaker, someone like Skapti Thorodsen, who served for nearly 3 decades, would listen patiently. He would then explain the relevant laws. He might recall precedents, other cases similar to this one, and how they were resolved. This was more than just a simple consultation. It was an educational process. The farmer would return to his home not just with an answer to his problem, but with a deeper understanding of the law. young men who lived on the lawspeaker's farm. His sons and foster sons would listen to these discussions day after day. This was their legal education. They absorbed the law through osmosis, hearing it applied to real-world problems. This is how future law speakers were often trained. This role became even more concrete after the laws were finally written down. Around the winter of 1117 to 1118, a decision was made at the Althing to write down the laws of Iceland. The law speaker, at the time, Bergthor Ramsson, along with other wise men, undertook this massive project. They produced the first version of the manuscript that would become known as the Gragas, or Grey Goose Laws. Once the law existed in a physical book, the law speaker's home took on a new importance. He was the custodian of one of the official copies of the law book. The book itself was an object of immense value and authority. It was likely kept in a locked chest, protected from fire and damp. Now, when a person came to consult the law speaker, the process might be different. The law speaker might listen to the problem and then say, "Let us see what the book says." He would retrieve the calfskin vellum manuscript, and together they would find the relevant passage. The law speaker's home was transformed from a purely mental archive into a physical one. It was the closest thing the Icelandic Commonwealth had to a Supreme Court library. This didn't diminish the law speaker's role, it enhanced it. He was now not only the master of the memorized law, but also the chief interpreter of the written text. His farm remained the central point of legal knowledge in the country, a place where the spoken tradition and the new written word came together. A journey to the law speaker's home was a journey to the very source of the law itself. Number 9. They could be political power brokers. While the office of the law speaker was intended to be impartial, the men who held it were not saints. They were powerful chieftains deeply involved in the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined Icelandic politics. A man with such a deep knowledge of the law and such a prominent public platform could use his position to advance his own interests and those of his family. No one exemplifies this better than Snorri Sturluson. Snorri was born in 1179 into the powerful Sturlung clan. He was ambitious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He was elected law speaker for the first time in 1215 and served until 1218. He was elected again from 1222 to 1231. During his time in office, he was not merely a neutral reciter of laws. He was an active and cunning political player. Snorri used his legal expertise as a weapon. He knew every loophole, every procedural trick. In his personal disputes over land and power, he could outmaneuver his opponents in court because he understood the system better than they did. He could guide his allies on how to frame their cases for the best chance of success, and how to trip up their enemies on technicalities. At the Althing, when a case involving his interests was being heard, his position as law speaker gave him enormous influence. While he wasn't the judge, his summary of the relevant laws delivered from the law rock could subtly shape the opinions of the men serving on the court. His political maneuvering went far beyond the courts of the Althing. Snorri developed a close relationship with the king of Norway, Håkon Håkonarsson. At the time, the Norwegian crown was actively trying to bring Iceland under its control. Snorri saw an opportunity. In 1220, he traveled to Norway and became a liegeman of King Håkon. In exchange for royal favor and support, he essentially promised to help persuade the Icelandic chieftains to accept Norwegian rule. This was a radical act for a law speaker whose primary duty was to the Icelandic Commonwealth. He was using his office as a bargaining chip in international politics. He returned to Iceland as the most powerful chieftain in the country, backed by the authority of the Norwegian king. His second term as law speaker from 1222 was marked by this conflict of interest. He was meant to be the guardian of Icelandic law, but he was also an agent of a foreign power that sought to dissolve that very system. Snorri's story shows the full potential of the law speaker's office as a political tool. He used the prestige of the position to build alliances. He used his knowledge of the law to enrich himself and defeat his rivals. And he used his status as Iceland's foremost legal mind to negotiate with kings. His career demonstrates that the law speaker was not always a detached scholarly figure. In the hands of an ambitious man like Snorri, the office could become the command center for a vast political and economic enterprise. Ultimately, his ambition was his undoing. His shifting allegiances made him powerful enemies, and in 1241 he was assassinated by his rivals, acting on the orders of the King of Norway, whom Snorri had defied. His life is a testament to the fact that in Viking society, law and politics were never truly separate. Number 8, the office existed outside of Iceland. The role of the law speaker is most famously associated with Iceland, thanks to the rich details provided in the Icelandic sagas. But the office was not an Icelandic invention. It was a common feature of the legal systems throughout the Scandinavian world. The Icelanders adopted and adapted the institution from their Norwegian homeland. Law speakers, or lagmen in Old Norse, were central figures at the regional assemblies, things in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. In Norway, before its unification under a single king, the country was divided into several legal regions, each with its own thing. The most important of these were the Frostathing in Trondelag and the Gulathing in the west. Each of these assemblies had its own law speaker. And when the Icelander Ulfljótur traveled to Norway around 927 AD to study law, he was attending the Gulathing. He observed the Norwegian law speaker in action, how he was chosen, how he recited the law, and how he advised the people. He then brought this model back to Iceland. The Norwegian law speakers, however, operated in a slightly different context. As Norway began to consolidate under a monarchy, the law speaker's role changed. He became less of an independent authority and more of a royal official. He still recited the law, but he also represented the king's interests at the thing. The king would often consult the law speaker when creating new laws. This was a significant difference from Iceland, where the law speaker answered only to the chieftains who elected him, not to a king. In Sweden, the role of the law speaker was perhaps even more powerful, especially in the early days. Sweden was divided into provinces, or folklands, such as Uppland and Västergötland. Each had its own law and its own law speaker lagman. The law speaker of Uppland was considered the most important in the kingdom. At the Thing of all Swedes at Uppsala, it was the law speaker, not a priest or a nobleman, who had the right to proclaim the election of a new king. Or the candidate would be raised on a stone, and the law speaker would strike the first blow in acclamation. A famous Swedish law speaker was Eskil Magnusson, who held the office in Västergötland in the early 13th century. He was a member of the powerful House of Bjalbo, which would later produce a line of Swedish kings. Eskil was not just a legal expert, he was a major political figure. A surviving portion of the Västgötalagen, the law of his province, contains a list of the previous law speakers. This shows the deep historical continuity of the office. The law itself was seen as a tradition passed down through a lineage of wise men. Eskil's role demonstrated that in Sweden, as in Iceland, the law speaker was a cornerstone of society, a bridge between the past and the present. His knowledge of the old laws gave him the authority to legitimize new kings. This power to speak the law was a fundamental concept of governance across the entire Viking world. Number 7, they were key figures in the transition to written law. For centuries, the law of the Norse peoples was an oral tradition. It was a living thing, held in memory and passed down through the spoken word. The law speaker was the master of this tradition, but the 12th and 13th centuries saw a major technological and cultural shift in Scandinavia, the rise of literacy, and the codification of law into written books. The law speakers, the champions of the oral world, were paradoxically the central figures who ushered in the age of the written word. This transition was not simple. It was a monumental undertaking that required deep knowledge, authority, and a great deal of painstaking work. The decision to write down the law was a recognition that the old oral system, while resilient, was also vulnerable. A law speaker's death could create a knowledge gap. As laws became more complex, relying on a single memory became increasingly risky. In Iceland, this process began in the winter of 1117. The Althing made a historic decision. They appointed a committee, led by the law speaker Bergthor Rafsson and the wise priest Haflidi Masson, to write down the laws of the land. They spent the winter at Haflidi's farm, meticulously recording the laws as they knew them. This was not a matter of simple dictation. They had to compare different versions, settle disputes about wording, and organize the vast body of oral tradition into a logical, coherent text. The law speaker's role was critical. Bergthor was the final authority on what the law actually was. His memory, honed by years of public recitation, was the primary source document. The result of their work was a manuscript known as Haflida Skra. The following summer, in 1118, this written law was brought to the Althing. It was read aloud from the law rock. The assembled chieftains then debated and formally approved it. The oral law had been successfully transferred to vellum. A similar process occurred in other parts of the Norse world. In Norway, King Magnus VI, who reigned from 1263 to 1280, was known as Magnus the Lawmender. He initiated a project to create a single, unified law code for the entire kingdom, replacing the old regional laws of the Gulathing and Frostathing. To do this, he relied heavily on the knowledge of the regional law speakers. These men were brought to his court. They recited the old laws, explained their meanings, and advised the king's scribes on how to best harmonize the different traditions. The law speaker was the bridge connecting the ancient, local customs to the new, centralized royal law. This transition changed the nature of the law speaker's job. He was no longer the sole repository of the law. The book now shared that burden, but his importance did not diminish. He became the chief interpreter of the written text. The law was still complex, and the written word could be ambiguous. People still needed an expert to explain what the text meant and how it applied to their specific situation. The law speaker evolved from a living library into the nation's most senior legal scholar and interpreter. He was the one who ensured that the spirit of the old oral law was not lost in the new letters on the page. Number 6, their physical position at the Thing was symbolic. The Viking Age Assembly, the Thing, was not just a legal proceeding, it was a piece of social theater. Every action, every location was imbued with meaning. The law speaker's role was defined not just by what he said, but by where he said it. His physical position at the assembly was a powerful symbol of his authority and the centrality of the law in their society. In Iceland, the heart of the Althing was the Logberg, the Law Rock. This was a natural rock outcropping on the plain of Thingvellir. It was from this specific spot that the law speaker performed his most important duties. When he recited the annual third of the law, he stood on the Logberg. When he was asked to rule on a point of legal procedure, he delivered his opinion from the Logberg. When the Althing was officially opened or closed, the declaration was made from the Logberg. This was not just a convenient platform. The Logberg was sacred ground, the physical center of their nation. By standing there, the law speaker was elevated, both literally and figuratively, above the crowd. His voice could carry further, but more importantly, his words were given a special weight. He was not speaking as a private individual, as a chieftain, or as a farmer. He was speaking from the Logberg, as the voice of the law itself. The location transformed the man. The area around the Law Rock was also significant. The chieftains with voting rights, the Godar, had their designated places near the Logberg. The general public stood further back. This geography reinforced the social and political hierarchy. But the law speaker stood at the focal point of it all. He was accessible to everyone, yet set apart. Any free man could approach him with a question, but his official pronouncements were delivered from a place of unique authority. This use of a specific, traditional location for legal pronouncements was not unique to Iceland. In Sweden, at the famous Mora Thing where kings were elected, there was a special stone, the Stone of Mora. The newly elected king would be hailed while standing on this stone. The law speaker, who played a key role in the election, would also have had a designated place of honor at this assembly. In Norway, the regional things like the Gulathing also had specific traditional sites. The law speaker would have a recognized seat or standing place within the consecrated area of the assembly. The symbolism of this is profound. The law was not something created in a closed room or a palace. It was proclaimed in the open air, from a natural feature of the landscape. It was grounded in the land itself. The law speaker, by standing on the law rock, was channeling a power that was seen as ancient and enduring. He was connecting the people gathered before him to the generations that had gathered in that same spot before to hear the same laws. His physical position was a constant reminder that the law was the foundation upon which their entire society was built. Number 5, they had to be men of wealth and standing. The law codes did not explicitly state that a law speaker had to be rich. In theory, any free man who was wise, articulate, and respected could hold the office. But in practice, the role was almost exclusively held by powerful chieftains. There were very practical reasons for this. The job of law speaker required resources and a social network that only a wealthy man could possess. First, consider the travel involved. To attend the Althing in Iceland, a man might have to travel for over 2 weeks, crossing rugged mountains and glacial rivers. He couldn't travel alone. A man of importance needed an entourage for protection and assistance. A law speaker would travel with a large group of household members, kinsmen, and supporters. This required a significant number of horses for riding and for carrying supplies, tents, cooking gear, food, and goods for trade. Outfitting and feeding such an expedition was a major expense. A poor farmer simply could not afford it. Second, the law speaker had to offer hospitality. His booth at the Althing would be a center of activity. People would constantly be coming to him for advice. He was expected to provide food and drink for his visitors. Similarly, at his home farm, during the rest of the year, he was a public figure. As we've seen, his home was a legal archive and consultation center. This meant a steady stream of guests, all of whom had to be fed and housed according to the strict rules of Viking hospitality. This constant drain on resources could only be sustained by a man with a large, productive farm and substantial wealth. Third, a law speaker needed to be independent. His role required him to be impartial, at least in theory. A man who was poor would be vulnerable to bribery or intimidation. A powerful chieftain might try to influence his legal opinion with the promise of a gift or the threat of violence. A wealthy law speaker, a man like Snorri Sturluson, who owned multiple large estates, was less susceptible to this kind of pressure. He had his own power base, his own wealth, and his own armed followers. He could afford to be independent. His wealth was a shield that protected his legal integrity. This is why the list of Icelandic law speakers is a roll call of the most powerful families in the country. Men like Thorkel Mani, Skapti Thoroddsson, and Snorri Sturluson were not just legal scholars, they were major players in the political and economic life of the Commonwealth. Their wealth gave them the freedom and the means to perform the duties of the office, and their status as chieftains gave their legal opinions the weight they needed to be respected. The law might be for everyone, but the job of speaking it was, by practical necessity, a job for the elite. Number 4, they played a role in declaring outlawry. In Viking society, there was no police force and no prison system. The most severe punishment that the law could impose on a person was not execution, but outlawry. An outlaw was a person who was placed outside the protection of the law. He was no longer considered a member of society. His property was confiscated. He could be killed by anyone without penalty. To be made an outlaw was a social death sentence. The law speaker played a formal role in this solemn and terrifying process. The decision to make someone an outlaw was made by a court at the Thing. If a man was found guilty of a serious crime, like murder or a major theft, the court would sentence him to outlawry. But the sentence was not final until it was formally proclaimed to the entire assembly. This is where the law speaker came in. After the court had passed its sentence, the verdict would be taken to the law rock. It was the duty of the successful plaintiff, the person who had brought the case against the newly condemned man, to announce the sentence. But the law speaker's presence and validation were crucial. He would be there at the law rock, ensuring that the proclamation was made in the correct legal form. He was the official witness to the act of casting a man out of society, and Njál's saga gives a vivid, if literary, account of how this worked. When Flosi Thordarson and his followers are prosecuted for the burning of Njál's farm, they are eventually sentenced to outlawry. The saga describes the legal battle at the Althing in great detail. After the court delivers its guilty verdict, the sentence has to be made public. The law speaker at the time would have presided over this final, formal act. The names of the condemned men would be read out for all to hear. From that moment on, they were fair game. The law speaker's role here was ceremonial but vital. It ensured that this ultimate sanction was carried out with the full authority of the law. It wasn't just a private feud where one family declared another to be its enemy. It was a public, legal act validated by the highest legal official in the land. This gave the sentence legitimacy and encouraged the entire community to enforce it. Everyone who heard the proclamation at the Law Rock knew that it was now their right, and in some cases their duty, to shun or even attack the outlaw. This function also highlights the separation of powers in their system. The court, a panel of chieftains, decided the verdict. The plaintiff announced the sentence. The law speaker officiated the proclamation. He did not decide who should be an outlaw. He ensured that when someone was declared an outlaw, it was done according to the strict letter of the law. He was the guarantor of the process, the man who made sure that even the most extreme act of justice was wrapped in the proper legal forms. Number 3, the role was sometimes divided. The job of the law speaker was immense. It combined the roles of a Supreme Court justice, a law professor, and the Speaker of a parliament. It required a perfect memory, a powerful voice, a talent for diplomacy, and a deep understanding of human nature. It is not surprising that sometimes finding one man who possessed all these qualities was difficult, or that the duties themselves became too much for a single person to bear. In some parts of the Scandinavian world, the role of the law speaker was split into 2 separate functions. This was particularly true in Sweden, in the great Swedish provinces like Västergötland and Uppland. The office of the lagman law speaker eventually evolved. While the law speaker remained the preeminent legal expert and the reciter of the law, a new position emerged alongside him, the talesman. The talesman's job was specifically to be the spokesman for the people at the thing. If a group of farmers had a grievance or a proposal they wanted to bring before the assembly, they would go to the talesman. He would then be their advocate, speaking on their behalf to the law speaker and the assembled chieftains. He was a professional public speaker, a representative who could articulate the concerns of the common man in the formal and often intimidating setting of the thing. This division of labor was a practical solution to a growing problem. As society became more complex, the law also became more complex. The law speaker had to spend more of his time focused on the technical details of the legal code. He became more of a scholar and an adjudicator of procedure. This left less time for the political aspect of the role, for listening to the general will of the people. The talesman filled this gap. Consider a hypothetical case from 12th century Sweden. A new king wants to levy a tax for a military campaign. The king's representative would present the proposal at the Thing of all Swedes. The law speaker would then be asked for his opinion on the legality of the tax according to the ancient laws of the land. He might say, "The law allows the king to call for a levy, but only under these specific circumstances." Then the talesman would speak. He would represent the views of the farmers who would have to pay the tax. He might say, "The free farmers of Uppland accept their duty to defend the kingdom, but the harvest was poor this year. We ask that the levy be postponed or that it be paid in grain instead of silver." In this scenario, the law speaker is concerned with the law as it is. The talesman is concerned with the political and practical reality of applying that law. Thus together, they provided a more balanced form of governance. The law speaker ensured that tradition and legal principle were respected. The talesman ensured that the voice of the people was heard. This division was less formal in Iceland, but a similar dynamic existed. While the law speaker was the ultimate authority, powerful chieftains and orators would often act as the talesmen for their followers, arguing their cases and debating new laws. The Icelandic system relied on many men being skilled in public speaking. But the Swedish model, by creating a formal office of talesman, shows a clear recognition that the original, all-encompassing role of the law speaker was becoming too large for one man to handle effectively. It was an adaptation that allowed the legal and political system to grow and meet new challenges. Number 2, the law speaker's blessing sanctified the assembly. The thing was more than just a court and a legislature. It was a sacred event. The smooth functioning of the law was thought to depend on the goodwill of the gods or God after the conversion. Before any legal business could be conducted, the assembly grounds had to be consecrated or set apart from the ordinary world. This act of sanctification was a crucial ritual, and in many places it was a duty that fell to the law speaker. In pagan times, this process was called the V-bond. A rope would be strung around the area where the court would sit, creating a sacred enclosure. This was the A space of peace and order. Within the V-bond, no weapons were to be drawn, and all disputes were to be settled with words, not violence. To violate this peace was a serious crime, an offense not just against men, but against the gods who oversaw justice like Tyr or Odin. The law speaker, or a local chieftain acting in a similar capacity, would lead this ritual. He would call for peace and declare the thing open. This was often referred to as hallowing the thing. His words were a form of legal and religious incantation. By speaking them, he transformed a common piece of ground into a courtroom, a place where the law could work its magic. The Gulathing law from Western Norway provides a specific formula for this. The law speaker was to begin the assembly with a prayer. He would ask the assembled people to listen in silence. He would then ask for a blessing on their meeting, that they might make decisions that were good for the land and the people. He would formally declare the peace of the thing, reminding everyone of the severe penalties for breaking it. This role continued even after the conversion to Christianity. The pagan gods were replaced by the Christian God, but the need for a formal, sacred opening to the assembly remained. The law speaker's opening speech would now be a Christian prayer. He would ask for God's guidance in their deliberations. But the function was the same. His words were the key that unlocked the legal process. Without his blessing, the thing could not begin. Imagine the scene at the Frostething in Norway around the year 950. The law speaker, a man of great age and renown, stands before the assembled chieftains and farmers. He holds a sacred staff or ring, a symbol of his office. He raises his voice and calls for silence. He then recites the ancient formula, declaring the ground to be holy and the peace of the thing to be in effect. He calls upon the gods to witness their proceedings and to punish any who would defile the assembly with falsehood or violence. Only after this solemn ritual is complete can the first legal case be heard. This duty shows that the law speaker was not just a legal technician. He was a figure with a priestly function. He was the intermediary between the world of men and the divine sources of law and order. His blessing was what made the assembly a legitimate place of judgment. It reinforced the idea that the law was not just a human invention, but a sacred principle that held their world together. The law speaker did not just speak the law, he inaugurated the very possibility of lawfulness. Number 1, the first duty of a new law speaker was to recite the rules of the thing itself. When a new law speaker was chosen, he faced an immediate and critical test. His very first official act upon taking office at the assembly was not to rule on a complex case or to propose a new law. It was to recite from memory the section of the law code that governed the procedures of the thing itself. This section was known in Iceland as the Thingskapathatter, the section on the ordering of the thing. This was the most important part of the entire law code, because without it, nothing else could happen. This section laid out the fundamental rules of their government. It specified how the Althing was to be opened and closed. It detailed the number of judges required for each court. It described the duties of the chieftains. It set the boundaries of the sacred peace of the thing. It was the constitution of the Icelandic Commonwealth and the operating manual for its annual assembly. By reciting this section first, the new law speaker accomplished several things at once. First and foremost, he proved his competence. This was his public audition. If he could flawlessly recite this complex and vital part of the law, the assembled chieftains and farmers would have confidence in his ability to handle the rest of his duties. A single stumble or sign of uncertainty would cast doubt on his fitness for the office. The pressure must have been immense. Second, this act reaffirmed the foundation of their legal system for everyone present. It was a public refresher course in civics. Every person at the thing, from the most powerful chieftain to the youngest farmer attending for the first time, was reminded of the rules that bound them all. It set the stage for the rest of the assembly, ensuring that everyone was operating from the same set of agreed-upon principles. Let's picture the election of Sturmir Karlsson the Learned as law speaker of the Althing in 1232. He was taking over in a time of great turmoil and civil strife in Iceland. His predecessor had been the great Snorri Sturluson. The chieftains would have gathered, and after the vote, Sturmir would have been led to the Logberg. A hush would have fallen over the crowd. This was the moment of truth. Sturmir would have taken a deep breath and begun to speak. He would not have been reading from a book. He would be pulling the words from his memory, words he had likely been rehearsing for months. He would have recited the ancient formulas for hallowing the thing, for setting up the courts, and for defining the powers of the various officials. His voice would need to be clear and steady. As he spoke, he was not just reciting rules, he was actively constituting the assembly. His words were bringing the government of Iceland into being for another year. When he finished, successfully and without error, a collective sigh of relief and approval would have gone through the crowd. The Vapnatak, the rattling of weapons against shields, would signify their acceptance. He had passed his test. The Althing was now legally in session. Only then could the ordinary business of lawsuits, legislative debates, and political maneuvering begin. This first crucial recitation was the bedrock on which everything else was built. It was the ultimate demonstration of the lawspeaker's primary role to be the living memory and the authoritative voice of the very structure of their society.